For 3 years, Serafina Hale had a secret that no one knew about. Not her executive assistant, not her board of directors, not even her closest friend. In 27 separate blind dates, she had shown up looking like someone who had nothing. No designer clothes, no luxury car waiting at the curb. No hint of the empire she had built from scratch by the time she was 29. Every single time, the man across the table had smiled, ordered dessert on her behalf, and then made his exit before the check arrived. Every single time, until the night she met a man who could not afford the dinner either but stayed anyway. His name was Elias Carter. He was 38 years old, worked with his hands for a living, and had a 7-year-old daughter at home who needed medication that cost more than most people's car payments. He had not signed up for the date himself. His best friend Marcus had done it as a kind of joke, a small, affectionate push toward a world Elias had quietly closed himself off from ever since his wife died. Elias hadn't planned on showing up, but he did, and that changed everything for both of them. Elias's life had been built almost entirely around necessity. He had trained as an HVAC technician in his mid-20s, a practical choice made by a practical man who understood that buildings always needed heating and cooling, and that skilled technicians were never truly out of work. He had married his wife, Claire, when he was 26, and they had been the kind of couple that made other people around them feel briefly more hopeful about things in general. Claire had been a nurse. She had been organized, funny, and constitutionally incapable of leaving a room in disorder. When she got sick, a diagnosis that arrived 2 days before Lily's 4th birthday and took her a year later, Elias had continued going to work every morning, because what else does a person do? He had continued making Lily's lunches and reading her stories at night and answering her questions about where Mommy had gone with as much honesty as a man could offer a 4-year-old. He had continued, because Lily needed him to, because continuing was the only form of courage available to him, and because somewhere under all of it he believed not loudly but steadily that things would eventually become manageable again. Serafina had not always been guarded. There was a version of her younger, softer, dangerously trusting who had loved without conditions. That version had believed a man named Derek Holloway when he said he wanted to spend his life with her. She had been 24, freshly promoted at the investment firm where she had clawed her way up from junior analyst, and still naive enough to think that charm was a substitute for character. Derek had known exactly who she was and what she owned before he ever asked her name at that gallery opening. He had researched her. He had built a version of himself that fit perfectly against her edges. And she, in her eagerness to be chosen, had missed every warning. The engagement lasted 8 months. The prenuptial agreement he had handed her, written by his own attorney, full of clauses she later understood, were designed to slowly transfer assets across the course of a marriage, was the first thing that cracked the illusion. When she brought it to her own lawyer, the man had set the papers down slowly and said, "Serafina, this was never about love." She had sat in that office for 40 minutes without moving. Something inside her had rearranged itself permanently that afternoon. She walked out of Derek's life with her company intact and her capacity for trust in ruins. The test had grown, in some ways, from a conversation with her therapist, a woman named Dr. Caldwell, who had the unhurried voice of someone who had heard most things and was rarely surprised. Dr. Caldwell had said, carefully, that Serafina seemed to struggle with separating her identity from her professional worth. Serafina had taken that observation and bent it into something harder, something almost punishing. She would go on dates as herself, stripped of all context. No last name, no job title, clothes borrowed from the back of her closet or picked up at a thrift store on purpose. She would be a woman between jobs, a woman behind on rent, a woman with nothing impressive to offer. She would watch what happened. She would learn the truth about the kind of man who found her interesting when there was nothing obvious to gain. The first date ended before the appetizers arrived. The man, tall, confident, wearing a watch that cost more than Serafina's first car, had glanced at her outdated coat and said he had just remembered a work call. He left $40 on the table, which did not cover half the bill. Serafina paid the rest in cash and went home and wrote the number 1 in a small notebook she kept in the top drawer of her home desk. The second man lasted longer. He was pleasant enough through the salads, attentive in the way that people are when they are still deciding whether to invest effort. When she mentioned, carefully, that she had been between jobs for a few months, his posture shifted. The warmth in his eyes didn't disappear. It reorganized itself into something more calculating. He began talking about his own income with a frequency that made the subtext impossible to miss. By the time the entrees arrived, he had pivoted the conversation entirely toward what she was looking for in a partner who was, and here he used the word twice, stable. She smiled and thanked him for his time and did not add his number to the notebook. The dates that followed fell into patterns she had not expected. A man named Gregory had been warm and funny through most of a dinner, genuinely interesting to talk to, until she mentioned she might need to move to a smaller apartment. He had finished his meal in near silence, kissed her on the cheek at the door, and sent a text the next morning that said he was busy for the next couple of months. A man named David had actually reached across the table and taken her hand at one point, looked at her with what seemed like real feeling, and then asked if he could borrow $80 for a parking issue he was dealing with. He had never mentioned it again. A man named Thomas had been kind, patient, good-looking in a quiet way, and had listened to her fabricated financial troubles with what seemed like genuine empathy, right up until she suggested their second date might need to be somewhere inexpensive. His response had taken 12 hours to arrive and had been 3 words long. Maybe next time. By the time she reached 27, the notebook had become something she barely looked at. The dates had blurred together a long parade of men who wanted a woman who could anchor them upward, who needed her to be impressive in order for their own lives to feel significant. One had sent a follow-up message 3 days after their date that read simply, "Hope things improve for you." She had stared at that message for a long time before deleting it. She had closed the notebook, put it in a box, and nearly convinced herself she was done with all of it. Then Marcus texted Elias a profile and a time and a restaurant address and told him to get out of the apartment for one evening. Elias had read the message at midnight while Lily slept in the next room, her small chest rising and falling steadily, her inhaler on the nightstand where it always was. He had thought about saying no. He had typed the word no twice and deleted it both times. In the end, he had agreed not because he wanted romance, but because Marcus had said please, and because Lily's doctor had mentioned that week that stress was making everything in that apartment worse, and because somewhere in the tired center of him, he remembered what it felt like to sit across from another person and simply be present. He arrived 7 minutes late because the bus had been delayed, and he had not wanted to spend extra on a rideshare on top of everything else. He walked in with his work jacket still on dark canvas, slightly worn at the elbows from a year of crawling through tight spaces in office ceilings, and found her already seated at the table by the window. She looked like someone who had also not especially planned to be there. Her hair was loose and slightly damp at the ends, as though she had showered in a hurry and not bothered with the rest. She wore a gray sweater that was a size too large and was reading the menu the way people do when they are trying to appear occupied. He sat down and apologized for being late. She said it was fine. They looked at the menu together in a silence that was, unexpectedly, not uncomfortable. He noticed she ordered water when the server asked about drinks, and he ordered water too, not because he was mirroring her, but because he had already done the quiet arithmetic of what was in his wallet and decided that water was the honest answer tonight. There was no performance in the gesture. It was simply a man who knew what he had and ordered accordingly. She said, almost carefully, "I'm kind of in between things right now, work-wise." She watched his face the way she had learned to watch faces for the micro-expression of recalculation, the slight dimming that happened when a man decided she was less worth his time than he had hoped. Elias nodded slowly and said, "Yeah, that happens to most people at some point." He said it the way someone says a thing they have lived, not the way someone says a thing to seem kind. Then he asked what kind of work she had done before, and she gave him the vague answer she always gave, and he listened as if the answer actually interested him, and she realized she had not been prepared for that. They talked for 90 minutes. He told her about Lily not in a way designed to seem noble, but in the natural, unguarded way that parents talk about their children when they forget to be careful about it. He said Lily had her mother's stubbornness and her grandfather's laugh, and that she had recently decided that all vegetables were the enemy except corn, which she had ruled was actually closer to a snack. Serafina had laughed at that, a real laugh, not the polished social kind, and something in Elias's expression had softened in a way she filed away without fully understanding why. When the check came, she watched him reach for it, not quickly, not with a flourish, but with the quiet resolve of a man who was going to do the right thing, even when the right thing cost more than he had comfortably available. She said she could cover her half. He said it was fine. She pressed, and he looked at her directly for the first time all evening and said, "I asked you here. I've got it." His voice was steady, and there was no performance in it, and she recognized, somewhere beneath the layers of her own defenses, that this was what dignity looked like when it had no audience and nothing to prove. She tested him more deliberately the next time they spoke. She mentioned, carefully, that she might have to give up her apartment, that the rent had become impossible, and she was not sure what came next. She said it lightly, watching for the exit. Elias was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "If you need somewhere to stay while you figure things out, I have a couch. It's not much, but it's there." He said it without hesitation and without expectation, and she understood, with a clarity that was almost physical, that he meant it entirely. She had given 27 men a version of this situation, in one form or another. Not one of them had offered her a couch. She took him up on it not because she needed a place to sleep, but because she needed to know what came after the offer. His apartment was on the 4th floor of a building that had seen better decades. The elevator worked only sometimes. The hallway smelled of someone's dinner garlic, something sweet and warm, and the carpet was the kind of industrial pattern chosen specifically because it did not show wear. But when Elias opened the door, something shifted. The apartment was small and imperfect and arranged with considerable care. Books on a low shelf, organized loosely by height. A drawing Lily had made a yellow house. An oversized sun taped to the refrigerator with tape that had been reused so many times it had lost most of its adhesion. A blanket folded over the arm of the couch with the deliberate neatness of someone who knew a guest was coming and wanted things to feel right. Lily was already in her pajamas when Serafina arrived. She regarded the visitor with the frank, uncomplicated curiosity of a child who had not yet learned to perform indifference. She said, "Dad said you needed somewhere to stay." Serafina said yes. Lily considered this and said, "Our couch is actually pretty comfortable. I've slept on it before when I had a bad dream and didn't want to wake Dad." Then she held out her hand very formally and said her full name, Lily Carter, and Serafina shook it. And Elias watched from the kitchen doorway with something quiet and complicated moving across his face. The days that followed were unlike anything in Serafina's recent experience. They ate dinner at a table that barely fit 3 chairs. Elias cooked simply pasta, rice, and vegetables, eggs scrambled with whatever was in the refrigerator, and he cooked well, in the way that people cook well when they have spent years making the most of limited ingredients. Lily assigned Serafina the job of stirring whenever possible, which Serafina suspected was less about the cooking and more about Lily's firm conviction that adults should always have something to do with their hands. They watched a movie one evening, all 3 of them on the too small couch, Lily asleep against Serafina's arm before the halfway point. Elias lifted his daughter gently and carried her to bed. And when he came back, Serafina was still in the same position, looking at the darkened television, and she felt a pressure in her chest that she recognized eventually as the weight of something she had been missing for a very long time. There were small things she noticed that she had not expected to notice. The way Elias left a nightlight on in the hallway without being asked because Lily sometimes got up for water in the dark. The way he had taped a list of Lily's medication times to the inside of the kitchen cabinet so it was visible when you opened it but hidden when you did not need it. A practical gesture that contained within it an entire theory of careful fatherhood. The way he laughed, not easily or often, but when something genuinely struck him as funny, fully, without any part of him holding back. Serafina had spent most of her adult life in rooms full of people whose laughter was calibrated for effect. Elias's was not. It belonged only to the moment that caused it, and it left no residue. She told him, on the fourth evening, that she owed money a significant amount, the kind that could follow a person and complicate things for anyone who got close. She said it directly, watching for the shift. Elias set down the dish he was drying and looked at her across the narrow kitchen. "How'd it happen?" he asked. She said it was complicated. He said, "Okay." Just that. He picked the dish back up and kept drying it, and after a moment said, "Everyone's made mistakes with money. Doesn't make them who they are." Serafina turned toward the window so he wouldn't see her face. She had told herself the test was nearly finished. She had told herself she was close to the conclusion she had been building toward for 3 years. But the truth, she was beginning to understand, had arrived much earlier than she had planned for. It had arrived wearing a work jacket and carrying exactly enough in his wallet to cover dinner and not one thing more. The call came on a Thursday afternoon. It was Elias's number, but the voice belonged to his neighbor Patricia, who had his phone because his own hands were shaking too badly to dial. She told Serafina that Elias was at Street Augustine's with Lily and that things had gotten serious very fast. Serafina was in her actual office, 22 floors above the city skyline, in the middle of a quarterly board presentation when her phone lit up. She walked out of the room without explanation, rode the elevator to the parking garage, and drove to the hospital herself. Lily had been working on a school project, a poster about weather systems. Her teacher would later tell Elias when the attack started. The school nurse had called the ambulance while Lily was still conscious and asking, very politely, if someone could call her dad. By the time Elias arrived, Lily was in a pediatric room with a mask over her face and 2 nurses moving around her with the particular efficient calm that Elias recognized, from experience he had never wanted to have, as the calm of people managing something that required their full attention. He had stood in the hallway and done the math that parents in his position always had to do, the brutal arithmetic of love and insufficient money. The question of what he owned that he could still sell, whether it would be fast enough, whether it would be enough at all. He had called Marcus. Marcus had said he would come and bring whatever he had. He had looked at the number the admissions clerk had written on a form and felt the specific exhaustion of a man who has been running hard enough to stay in place for years and has now finally run out of road. He had not cried. He had sat in a plastic chair beside his daughter's bed, held her small hand, and told her she was going to be fine. She had believed him with the complete trust of someone who had never had a reason not to. He had not yet figured out how to make it true. Serafina found him in that chair. She stood in the doorway of the room for a moment before he heard her. He looked up, and the confusion on his face was genuine. She was wearing clothes he had never seen, a fitted coat that cost more than his monthly rent. Her posture changed, her hair back in a way that altered the geometry of her entire face. She looked like someone else. She looked, he realized slowly, like someone who had never needed a couch to sleep on. She went to the nurse's station and spoke briefly and quietly. A billing administrator arrived within minutes, exchanged a few words with Serafina, and left with a tablet and a completed signature. Serafina came back and sat in the chair next to Elias. She put her hands in her lap and looked at Lily for a long time before she said anything. "I need to tell you the truth," she said. "About all of it," she told him. Not the version that made her sympathetic, the clean, justifiable account in which she was simply a wounded woman protecting herself with reasonable caution. She told him the real version, The fear that had calcified after Derek, the notebook, the 27 dates, the deliberate and sustained construction of a persona designed to reveal what men were made of when there was nothing to gain from staying. She told him she had never intended for it to last as long as it had. She told him that Lily's face on that first evening at the apartment had knocked something loose in her that she had not known was still attached. She told him he was the only person, in 3 full years of trying, who had not walked away. Elias listened without moving. His jaw was set. When she finished, the silence between them had texture and weight, and she did not try to fill it. Lily breathed steadily through the mask on the bed, and the monitors kept their quiet rhythm, and Elias looked at his daughter for a long time before he looked back at Serafina. He said, "So, the whole time, every conversation, every dinner, the couch." He stopped, started again. "You were testing me." She said yes. He stood slowly. He did not raise his voice. He did not knock anything over, or do any of the things that anger sometimes looks like when it has an audience. He simply stood, carefully, the way a man stands when he is holding something fragile inside him and cannot afford to break it in a hospital room in front of his sick child. He said, "Thank you for paying for Lily." He said it the way he would have said it to a stranger who had performed a kind and impersonal act. Then he picked up his jacket and walked out. Serafina sat in the chair he had left. The monitor beeped softly 3 times and then fell back into its rhythm. She stayed until Lily's color returned, until the doctor came in with a reassuring voice and a reasonable discharge timeline, until the nurse brought apple juice in a small paper cup and Lily drank it with her eyes half open and did not ask where her father was. Serafina told her he had stepped out for a moment. Lily accepted this with the complete ease of a child who had never been given a reason to doubt. Serafina drove home and sat in her kitchen without turning on the lights. She gave him 2 days. On the second evening, she stood outside his apartment door without knocking for 4 full minutes. She had attempted 3 times to write out what she wanted to say and deleted all 3 versions, because every one of them began with a justification, and she had finally understood that justifications were the last habit she needed to break. She knocked. He opened the door with a dish towel in his hand, which meant she had interrupted dinner, which meant Lily was probably at the table behind him. He did not close the door. She took that as the only available permission. "I'm not going to explain it again," she said. "I just want to say something." She looked at him directly. "I spent 3 years building a test because I was terrified, and I told myself I was being careful, but I was only being afraid. Every person I tested walked away, and I told myself that proved something important, but all it really proved was that I had built something designed to push people out before they could get close enough to hurt me. A beat. You are the only person who made me want to stop running the test, and I used that against you. And I am sorry." Elias was quiet. Behind him, from the kitchen, came the sound of a spoon hitting the side of a bowl. He said, "You lied to me." She said yes. He said, "For weeks." She said yes. He said, "And Lily got attached to you." He paused. "And so did I." He stepped back from the door, not exactly inviting her in, but making room for a conversation that needed more space than a doorway could hold. They talked for nearly 2 hours. Lily fell asleep on the couch during the first 20 minutes and did not stir. Elias asked his questions steadily, without heat, the questions of a man who needed to understand the structure of a thing before he decided whether it was still worth standing in. She answered all of them and softened none of the answers. He told her what had actually hurt him. It was not the poverty she had performed, which he had barely processed as something unusual, because it had changed nothing about how he felt in the moments they shared. What had hurt him was the idea that those moments had been, on her side, data. That the dinner he had stretched his budget for had been an observation. That Lily's laughter in the kitchen had been filed as evidence. She listened and did not argue, because he was right. and she had run out of the kind of pride that argues with right things. She said, "I don't need someone to pass a test. I think I just needed to meet someone who would make me want to stop running one." The words landed quietly in the room, with the particular weight of something that had been true for a while before the person speaking it caught up. He looked at her for a long time. Then he looked at Lily, asleep with one arm hanging off the couch cushion in the boneless ease of deeply sleeping children. He said, "She asked me this morning if you were coming back." Serafina waited. He said, "I told her I didn't know yet." A pause. Longer this time. Then, "I think maybe I know now." It was not an easy restoration. There was no single moment where everything repaired itself cleanly, and the story became uncomplicated. Elias was careful with her for a while in the measured way that people are careful with things they have decided to trust again, but have not yet learned to trust without effort. Serafina was patient with that carefulness in a way she had not previously understood herself to be capable of. She showed up as herself, not the performed version, not the strategically softened version, not the woman who always had a plan, just Serafina, who had made a significant mistake and was willing to carry it honestly, day by day, for as long as it needed carrying. She found the notebook one afternoon in a box she had never fully unpacked. She sat with it at her kitchen table and did not open it. Then she fed every page through her office shredder and stood there until the machine finished, and she did not feel catharsis or relief. She felt only the plain, practical clarity of a person who has finished doing something that should have been done a long time ago. Lily called her Serafina for 3 months, with great precision and a slight formality that occasionally made Elias hide a smile behind his coffee mug. Then, one afternoon, without announcement or ceremony, Lily looked up from the drawing she was making a picture of 3 people standing in front of a yellow house and said, in the tone of someone making a small but important correction to the world, "I'm going to call you Mom now. Is that okay?" She said it the way she said most things directly, without theater, with the absolute confidence of a child who has already made up her mind and is merely being courteous by asking. Serafina said yes. She said it before the careful part of her had time to weigh anything or calculate any risk. She said it the way Elias had once told a near stranger she could sleep on his couch without hesitation, without expectation, without anything except the simple and unguarded truth of what she wanted. Elias reached across the table and took her hand. He did not say anything. He did not need to. There is a version of this story where the lesson is about wealth, about the things money can purchase and the things it reliably cannot. But that was never really what it was about. It was about a woman who had been hurt so precisely and so completely that she had turned the shape of that hurt into a system, a controlled environment, a methodology for gathering information while remaining, herself, untouchable. And it was about a man who had no system at all, who showed up to a dinner he had not planned for, paid with money he could not comfortably spare, and offered his couch to a stranger not because he had weighed the return but because it was simply what a decent person did. The right things are often quiet. They do not announce themselves. They show up in worn work jackets. They order water without drama. They hold their daughter's hand through long hospital nights, and they step back from a closed door when